Well, I'm glad you decided to join us for podcast number 14 in my series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this podcast, we're going to take a careful look at the colony of Delaware. Delaware is one of the more obscure colonies. Its population was never very large, probably only about 37,000 people at the time of the Revolution. Delaware was first settled by the Dutch, especially the Swedish, and was originally known as New Sweden. After the English conquered the area, Delaware was part of Pennsylvania and was known simply as the Lower Three Counties. Being part of Pennsylvania helped protect Delaware from being absorbed by neighboring Maryland, but it was also the cause of frustration because the priorities of the people in Delaware were so different from those of Pennsylvania. Delaware was eventually granted the right to have its own legislature and in effect became a separate colony from Pennsylvania, though it continued to share a governor with Pennsylvania up until the Revolution. Delaware's obscurity also allowed it to operate with little notice from English officials and to develop an independent attitude. Delaware has sometimes been described as the little state with big ideas. The fact that Delaware was the first state to ratify the U.S. Constitution underscores this apt description. Yet Delaware still holds on to some of the old ways. It is the only state in the Union today that subdivides its counties into hundreds according to the old ancient English tradition. Delaware was a heavily forested place. The smell of trees and sassafras was said to drift far out to sea. In the fall, the Indians set fires to clear thickets and forests to aid in hunting. The local Delaware Indians were generally peaceful. This is probably because they had been conquered by the Susquehanna Indians. The first Europeans to settle Delaware were the Dutch, who in 1631 founded a colony called Zwanendal. I'm sure I'm not saying that properly. It meant Swan Valley because there were a large number of swans in the area. This is in the southern part of the state near Cape Henlopen. The Dutch hoped to use it as a place for which they could do whale fishing and also conduct raiding upon Spanish shipping. This settlement did not last long. It was massacred by the Indians. The story goes that the Dutch had set up a piece of tin with the coat of arms of the company or the nation, I'm not sure which. An Indian decided to steal this piece of tin. He wanted to make a tobacco pipe out of it. When the Dutch made a fuss over it, some other Indians killed this thief because they were afraid of losing the trade, apparently. The thief had some other friends who were Indians who decided they would retaliate against the Dutch, and so they went into this town of Zwanendal as traders. In other words, they came in with goods they were hoping to trade or made it look like they were trading, and then one by one killed the colonists until all of them were killed. The Dutch gave up on settling southern Delaware or any part of Delaware, and in 1633, the Dutch investors who backed the colony sold their interests. This Dutch colony had one important effect. It probably kept Delaware, or at least the southern part of it, from being absorbed by Maryland. The Baltimore family, which owned Maryland, in their grant to the land, they were told that they could only occupy areas that were not cultivated. And since Maryland was founded a year after this Zwanendal was founded by the Dutch, it was considered occupied. And therefore, the lords of Baltimore and their colony of Maryland were not allowed to absorb that area. While the Dutch were technically the first people to colonize Delaware, really the first chapter in Delaware's history belongs to the Swedish. During the first half of the 1600s, Sweden became a major player in European politics and in military affairs. Sweden was a major player in the 30 Years' War, which was probably Europe's most destructive war prior to World War I. Through conquest, Sweden had become one of the largest countries in Europe. Much of this expansion was due to the able leadership of their king Gustavus Adolphus, who is sometimes known as the Lion of the North and also as the father of modern warfare. With this rise in station, the Swedish decided it was time that they should have colonies like the other European nations. After all, why should France and Spain and England and the Dutch have all the glory and riches? So in 1626, King Gustavus issued a charter chartering a company to go ahead and start setting up colonies and engage in trade and a few other things as well. The problem was that even though the Swedes controlled the area or the land around the Baltic Sea, it was the Dutch who controlled the shipping in and out of the Baltic Sea, as well as in the Baltic Sea itself. So the Swedish colonizing effort really became a joint venture between the Dutch and the Swedish. The Swedish government provided the legal and political foundation, while the Dutch provided the investors and the capital as a private enterprise. Even though King Gustavus died in 1632 on the battlefield, the company that he chartered continued to move forward to try and set up these colonies, and his daughter Queen Christina took over. The first group of settlers from Sweden to arrive in Delaware were a mixed bunch of Swedish and Finnish colonists, and they arrived in Delaware in 1638. Their first settlement was in a defensible position where the Christina River and the Brandywine Creek meet. Today, that would be in the city of Wilmington, right, where those two rivers run into the Delaware River. In 1938, on the 300th anniversary of the landing of these first Swedish settlers, a monument was erected in the city of Wilmington on the site of the old Fort Christina. It was a gift from the people of Sweden, and a replica of it was set up in Gothenburg, Sweden, which is where the colonists left Sweden from to come to the North American colonies. One of the most interesting characters to arrive and to live in New Sweden was one of its governors, a man named Johann Prince. He arrived in 1643, and he was governor for 10 years, which was most of the colony's existence. He was said to be quite tall, about 6 feet, and by some accounts he was about 400 pounds. And also sometimes you hear stories of the Indians calling him Big Belly. He was an effective governor who kept things going, but he was also autocratic. Some of the Swedish colonists left to go be with the English or the Dutch, or just to leave. They wanted to get away. At one point, several of the colonists signed petitions complaining of Governor Prince's methods, that he was too harsh and avaricious. They also complained that he was carrying on trade with the Indians and with the Dutch for his own private enrichment. Upon learning of this, the governor rounded up the ringleader of the group and had him summarily tried and executed. In 1643, Prince sent a report back to Sweden, back to the chancellor, and I'll try and say his name here. I'm sure I don't say it with proper Swedish inflection. The chancellor's name was Axel Oxenstierna. I think that's about as close as I can get. Anyway, Prince's report is important because it gives us an idea of what was going on in the colony and some of the difficulties they were facing. He reports that the total population of all the Swedish colonists was 183 people, and consider that these people were scattered out along the Delaware and New Jersey sides of the Delaware River. So it was a pretty sparse population. He talked about the tobacco production. The company that owned New Sweden was intent on making money on tobacco, and they expected it to be produced. He stressed the important need for Sweden to send over more single women. Many of the men were not married. Apparently, New Sweden had the same problem that neighboring Virginia had, in that they didn't bring over enough women. It was mostly men that came over at first. And in Virginia, it was probably about 8 or 9 decades before they were actually reproducing their population naturally. One of the things that Prince bitterly complained about was the conduct of the Dutch. In fact, he wrote, "It is of the utmost necessity for us to drive the Dutch from the river, for they oppose us on every side. They destroy our trade everywhere. They strengthen the savages with guns, shot, and powder, publicly trading with these against the edict of all Christians. They stir up the savages against us, who but for our prudence would already have gone too far. They begin to buy land from the savages within our boundaries, which we had purchased already 8 years ago. I have several times written to their governor about all these improprieties, and also caused their arms to be cut down, but it did not make any difference. They see very well that we have a weak settlement, and with no earnestness on our side, their malice against us increases more and more." One of the things that Prince did that was very good was he made sure he got along with all of his neighbors. The Swedes got along with the Indians. They made sure not to offend the English, and they tried to get along with the Dutch. The simple fact of the matter was that New Sweden was the weakest of the colonies in North America. It was weaker than the Dutch, far weaker than the English, and they certainly were in no position to tangle with the Indians. Another important factor was religion. The Swedish, like the Dutch and the English, were Protestants, and that meant that in Europe they were often on the same side of issues at this time. Had the Swedish been Catholic, things might have come to a head much quicker. Nevertheless, it greatly irritated the Dutch that the Swedes occupied the mouth of the Delaware River. The Dutch knew that in order to develop their colonies, they had to have control of the Delaware River. After some initial maneuvering, in 1655, the Dutch began a siege of Fort Christina. And the irony here is that if the Swedes had been able to hold out for just 1 week longer, the Dutch would have had to break off their siege because they were having serious problems with the Indians because of their heavy-handedness. Nevertheless, the Swedish capitulated, and the Dutch took over New Sweden in 1655 and incorporated it as one of their colonies. In 1664, the English conquered New Netherlands, or all the Dutch colonies, and this included the remnants of New Sweden. So for a second time in little under 10 years, the Swedes have been forced to change flags. Swedish influence didn't go away, however. It still lingered in the background. Probably the most famous sign of Swedish tradition that lingered in American culture was the log cabin. When we think of the log cabin, we think of frontier settlers and pioneers, but really it was an invention the Swedish and the Finnish settlers brought over with them from the north. For at least another generation, Swedish women probably continued to call their livestock and other animals in from the forests in the traditional Swedish herding call. The Swedish government continued to demand compensation from the Dutch first and then later from the English for the conquest of Swedish territory. I've never been able to learn whether or not the Dutch or the English actually ever paid any of this compensation, though. Interestingly, as late as the 1800s, Swedish ministers from Sweden continued to minister among the flock of Swedish settlers and immigrants that were still in Delaware and scattered throughout New Jersey. So the ties between the former Swedish colonists and their homeland didn't easily or quickly go away. In 1681, King Charles II granted to William Penn the area that we call Pennsylvania today. Penn recognized, as did the Dutch, that in order to make Pennsylvania solvent and lucrative, he had to control the Delaware River. So the following year, the king's brother, the Duke of York, signed over to Penn all his interest in what was called the lower three counties on the Delaware. Today we call that the state of Delaware. So Penn effectively became the owner and proprietor of both colonies. There was some controversy, however, as to whether or not the Duke of York actually had the right to grant this land to Penn, and if he actually had the right to grant the rights to establish a government, since only the king could do that. The minute that William Penn came into possession of Delaware, he ended up in conflict with neighboring Maryland, and they spent a lot of time in the courts with the Baltimore family. These legal quarrels over the boundaries led to the famous Mason and Dixon survey line. We talked about that in the last podcast about Pennsylvania. And in fact, the boundary between Maryland and Delaware wasn't really fully established right up until the Revolutionary War. William Penn was important, though, because the Penn family had enough clout that they could kind of protect Delaware from being absorbed by Maryland and at the same time act as a buffer with the English government. So Delaware had a certain amount of independence under this arrangement that they might not have had otherwise. The people of Delaware and Pennsylvania were very different. In Pennsylvania, there were a lot of Quakers who were pacifists, whereas in Delaware, the people were not mostly Quakers. And Delaware has a fairly long coastline, and anytime there was a war with France or Spain or one of the other colonial powers, the people in Delaware wanted coastal defenses prepared. This went against the grain of the pacifist Quakers, and so there was a lot of conflict over this. In 1701, William Penn granted to Delaware, or the lower three counties, that they could have their own legislature and thereby enact their own laws and prepare their own defenses, although they still had to share a governor with Pennsylvania right up until the Revolutionary War. With their own assembly comfortably established at Newcastle, the colonial capital of Delaware, the people of Delaware began to slowly prosper and take control of their own affairs. Delaware was one of the few colonies without an established church or religion. Penn had determined that Pennsylvania, and certainly Delaware as well, would be religiously tolerant. So religious freedom was one of the things that attracted colonists to Delaware. In some ways, Delaware was an economic satellite of neighboring Pennsylvania and the city of Philadelphia, where a lot of the commerce went on. Still, Delaware had many important economic resources of its own, especially Brandywine Creek. Brandywine Creek provided water power for mills that could grind wheat into flour, and soon water power mills dotted Brandywine Creek's shores. One of these mills was reported to have been able to grind 100,000 bushels of wheat a year. In the late 1760s, as the British attempted to exert greater regulatory power over her colonies, Delaware stood with her sister colonies in defying these regulations and acts. During this resistance, there were two important leaders in Delaware that emerged above all the others who played key roles. The first of these I'll talk about is a man named John Dickinson. Dickinson wrote a series of editorials that ran in the newspapers and were later accumulated into a pamphlet called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania to the Inhabitants of the British Colonies. In these letters, Dickinson explained that if the British government had power to suspend colonial legislatures, or to force colonies to take care of soldiers, or the ability to pass taxes on the colonists without their own consent or the consent of their legislatures, that the British in effect had unlimited power to control the government, and therefore the people of the colonies were not free. Dickinson was very slow in coming around to independence. He felt that the colony should attempt first to try to seek a reconciliation with the king and with Parliament. His reluctance to accept independence as quickly as some of the other colonial leaders often made them suspicious that he was a loyalist. On the day that they voted for independence, John Dickinson did not show up, nor did he sign the Declaration of Independence. He felt that it was not yet time. For all his efforts to try and find a middle road, it didn't pay him off very well, for when the British occupied Philadelphia, they ended up burning his house anyway. However, once independence was voted upon and decided upon, Dickinson did come around to be a good leader and a committed patriot in the cause. The other person I want to talk about that became an important leader at this time in Delaware was a man named Caesar Rodney. He had quite a different attitude than John Dickinson on independence. He said, "The continuing to swear allegiance to the power that is cutting our throats is certainly absurd." During the debates in the Continental Congress over independence, each colony only got one vote. There's a dramatic story from Caesar Rodney's life in which he was home. He's said to have been sick. And when he heard that his colony's vote was deadlocked in the Continental Congress, he rode all that way, some say in a storm while he was sick, back to Philadelphia so that he could cast the tie-breaking vote for Delaware so that it would vote for independence. During the Revolutionary War, Delaware really didn't see that much action, although the British, when they occupied Philadelphia, they also occupied the Delaware town of Wilmington for a short time. They also conducted several raids into Delaware from Philadelphia. While the British occupied Philadelphia, George Washington considered making Wilmington his headquarters so he could keep an eye on the British, although he never did that. Delaware didn't have a large population, but the troops that it contributed to the Continental Army were tough and fought honorably throughout the war. If you're interested in learning more about colonial Delaware, I recommend the following books and articles. Colonial Delaware, A History by John A. Monroe. Colonial Pennsylvania, A History by Joseph Illick. The History of the Colony of New Sweden in 2 parts by Carl K.S. Springhorn and Gregory B. King. Published in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, Volume 7, Number 4, 1883, and Volume 8, Number 3, October 1884. The Report of Governor Johann Prince of New Sweden for 1647, and the Reply of Count Axel Oxenstierna, Chancellor of Sweden, published in the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, Volume 7, Number 3, 1883. Sweden, by Kristen Lindberg, published in the American Indian Quarterly, Volume 17, Number 2, Spring, 1993. The excellent music for this podcast was composed by Antonio Vivaldi, and it featured Alison Balsam on the trumpet. The kulning, or ancient Swedish cow calling, was provided by Jona Jinten.